You can't be an authoritarian regime without a threat. You need a threat. A plausible external threat linked to a plausible internal threat. Right? It's just got to be. Now, so these 6 characteristics, right, that I just went through, not every regime has all 6. Some have 5 out of 6. That's pretty good. I'll take that. Some only have 3 out of 6, and you can see that they're rockier. And some have all 6, and some are churning all 6 on all cylinders. Those are the regimes you want to do FDI in. They got staying power. Personalist regime that's based on a person, and that regime is not institutionalized, and so if that person gets, like, I don't know, liver cancer or sclerosis of the liver, there's no regime anymore because it's not deeply institutionalized, right? It's too personal. So there's that dimension, which I ought to go into greater depth to, but I'm not. Personalized regimes have trouble with blunders much more because authoritarian regimes lack corrective mechanisms. And if the person blunders a couple of times, there's a very high likelihood they'll blunder often, and it becomes a big problem that you have, especially if they have a son or a daughter and there's a regression to the mean in the genes. Now, this degree of professionalization is really important for the post regime. This is going to sound, this is going to actually skirt the line here, but the judiciary in the apartheid regime in South Africa was valuable. And the reason it's valuable is because it understood property rights. Now, it understood property rights only for a very narrowly defined citizenry. It enforced apartheid regime on the vast majority of the country. But if you expand the category citizen and you apply the property rights law to more citizens, you got a judiciary that could work. The communist era judiciaries, they didn't understand property rights. And they're of not much value in a post-communist transition because they don't get it. It's not that they're defending the rights of party figures to hold property and then they let everybody hold property, like the South African regime defends the rights of a handful of people, white property owners, and then they can defend the property rights of other people because they understand the way law works. So institutionalization can be crucially important in what happens when the regime topples. When you get those shards and you're trying to put together something else, institutionalization or not matters a lot. Or even when you're trying to overcome the regime. Professional armies with a security threat are very difficult to overcome. Very, very difficult to overcome. Because they're the life opportunities, they're the ideology, they're just, it's a rich thing. The Pakistan, Egyptian cases with professional armies are trouble to overcome stuff like that. Very difficult. It looked like the Chinese communists regained control over the military by forcing it partially out of business, out of the private economy in the 90s. It took something as strong as, or what looks strong, the Chinese Communist Party, to, as it were, domesticate the Chinese military in the 90s and kick it out of a lot of private business. Now we're seeing maybe that was a premature judgment on party control over the Chinese army. Analysts in the intelligence community, let alone in academia where they don't know the information on the inside, but intelligence analysts are split on the degree of control or not on the Chinese army. So, but in Pakistan, where the army, the professional army, exists as the reason of the state because of the threat from India and also owns a great deal of the economy, is extremely difficult to eradicate. Okay. Anyway, so those were just sort of sidebars, that there are other things that need to be talked about, like the degree or not of institutionalization, right? But this nationalism, populism, law and order which is often ignored. We often think that authoritarian regimes are cynical, but in fact they have belief mechanisms and they have loyalties which are based not solely on payoffs, but on versions of nationalism, populism, and so-called law and order, right? The external threat, the subversion. Okay. Now, it could be the case that having a full-fledged ideology is actually a weakness. The Iranian regime, for example, has this problem where they had an Islamic revolution. And when they fall short of an Islamic revolution, they get in trouble. They get critiqued on the basis of Islamism. And so having a full-fledged ideology is very empowering, it seems, but it can also be a point of vulnerability. Not having a full-fledged ideology, but just going to the well when you need it, looks like it's less empowering, but maybe more empowering. Okay, so let's summarize. So if you're a would-be analyst of an authoritarian regime, or you're a would-be creator of an authoritarian regime, there are such schools that you can go to. You need to understand politics and institutions, economics, sociology and social control, culture and the media, and of course the international system, just for the 6 attributes that I listed, let alone other attributes that I could go into. Now, a really good, that is to say a lucky authoritarian regime, gets its own populace to conduct most of the surveillance. That's a trick that is one great way to measure an authoritarian regime, where the society conducts surveillance on itself and reports on behavior that it observes of its citizens or fellow residents. Whether that's through housing committees or workforce people that is to say in the places of employment, or self-centering on the internet or whatever, right? Social control imposed by the society itself. That costs a lot less and you get a lot more bang for your buck. There are only so many policemen in any authoritarian regime, but there's a big society to conduct surveillance on itself. So that's one way you measure the sophistication and strength of a regime. Anyway, now, here's the problem. The problem, which is the proposition I started with. Success brings decay. Success brings trouble to authoritarian regimes. To make sure that one institution doesn't get too powerful, one state agency, one ministry, one bureaucracy doesn't get too powerful so that it could maybe push the leader aside, for example. So they establish tremendous numbers of overlapping jurisdictions. So it's often very hard to get anything done inside the regime, because 3 and 5 and 7 agencies are responsible for the same thing. And they're not going to want anybody else to get any credit. So they deny the other agencies and ministries the opportunity to perform their own functions. So by the desire not to have any one agency get too powerful, they can paralyze themselves. This happens again and again inside authoritarian regimes. Assign a second body to watch the first body, and assign a third body to watch the second body, and pretty soon you've got a morass. Now, at the same time, in order to make sure that you're getting information up the pipeline, in order to make sure that people are reporting what's going on, you need tremendous numbers of rivalries, jealousies, mutual hatreds inside the regime. The army has to hate the police have to hate the army has to hate the Navy has to hate the army. Otherwise, you never find out what's going on. It's because the Navy hates the army that the Navy tattles on the army and tells you what's actually going on in the army. But these rivalries and jealousies, these cutthroat competition within authoritarian regimes also is extremely dysfunctional. Extremely dysfunctional. The overlap, the sabotage, very inefficient, often debilitating. Authoritarian regimes become extremely ponderous. They start to get fat. They start to proliferate agencies. They start to have so many investigative bodies that nothing gets investigated anymore, because everybody is investigating everyone at the same time. There are many other problems that I could go into. The so-called cutting off the head of the tallest flower, or sometimes what's known as negative selection. Negative selection is when you're the leader of the club and you want to stay the leader of the club, and you appoint as your deputy the stupidest person in the room, besides yourself. And that way, you're never under threat, because that person is just not smart enough to outsmart you and to take power away from you. And that's at the top, and then at the next level, and the next level. So everybody is looking for a less competent deputy than themselves. This is known, as I say, as negative selection. You select for incompetence, lack of initiative, lack of foresight. This is a huge problem in all authoritarian regimes. I see it where I work all the time. Yes, I do. The fear of the talented is a big problem, a very big problem. Now, there are many other problems that I could go into, authoritarian regimes. The biggest one, though, is the succession problem.